What's up? This is the Snodgrass podcast, and I got Patrick Grayson on this podcast episode with me. Really interesting story. So you guys are going to want to stick around. He is a third-generation real estate investor, and we really dive into the story of it started with his grandpa and then to his dad. They were both full-time real estate investors. Now he owns his own contracting business, also is a full-time real estate investor, and really just go through the generations. He tells stories. They're funny. It's just a really awesome interview with Patrick, but he's also a dad of young kids, a husband, and he talks about his father not only modeling what it was like to run a business and have rental properties and all that, but what it was like to model being a good father and a good human being to his tenants and having integrity. And it's just an amazing episode. You guys are going to want to stick around for Patrick Grayson. Before I get into that, we got a lot of stuff going on. So 2023, Iron Deep, we're putting the vision out. I've said this before, but if this is your first time listening to this, to our particular podcast, Iron Deep is our organization, and we have a website, irondeep.com. And what we're doing here, guys, is we're inviting businessmen, business owners, basically business owner men that not only want to have an awesome business, but to be the best man through Christ that they can be, to live as a great dad, as a great husband, and to really to live that out and leave that lasting legacy that God has called us to. This is the community that Iron Deep is. This is the community that we're building. We're having undistracted men's awakening retreats in very undistracted places. And this is where the walls come down. It's very undistracted, very intentional, and very unique in some of the greatest beauties of the world that God created. And if you're interested in that, go to irondeep.com and make sure you apply for one of our events that's coming up. These are awesome. Patrick had been to an event before, and we're doing some awesome things with that. The biggest thing is we're building out this Iron Deep community. Go over to YouTube. YouTube is where we're storing our videos. So we're coming out with videos. We just came out with one called The Identity Crisis. And it's a video where I really dove into the identities of men and the crisis that we're seeing. That they don't know who they are when they're detached from what they do for a living. If you detach what you do for a living, the question is, who are you? And we went through the identity crisis that's happened across America and it's happened across the world. Men were suffering, and it's time for us to rise up. And Iron Deep is a community that we as men, we are going to take a stand. We're going to rise up. We're going to live out our purpose, our identity, and legacy through Christ, through our businesses, and through this organization. And we're going to impact the world. If you guys want to be a part of that, that is the invitation that we're offering to you guys. Now, I want to introduce you to my good friend, Patrick Grayson. What's going on, Patrick? Mr. Grayson.
Hey. Yeah, I'm here for it. Thanks for having me on.
No, thanks, man. Thanks for being on the show today. Man, I'm really looking forward to this episode, number one, because I don't think I've ever really had this specific topic. Number one, we're really going to talk about he's a third-generation investor. And we're really going to just dive in. It started with his grandfather and then his dad, now him. And then we're going to talk about how he's passing it on. And, one of the things that we love to talk about here just in the Iron Deep community is to live out your purpose, to live out your true legacy, right? And I think that Patrick's family has done a lot of that and passing on their wisdom with real estate investing and some other things as well. We're going to dive into that today, and we'd love to hear Patrick just kind of how he's passing it on to his kids, which are pretty young right now. They're 6 and 8, but Miles and Max. But we're going to talk about that. But Patrick, let's just kind of dive into you, man. Let's just, before we get started and dive into third generation real estate investing, let's talk about Patrick. So who is Mr. Patrick Grayson?
Oh, now that's a question. Let's see. I spend a lot of my time trying to figure out business, figure out how to invest in real estate, make the most of my time, all that fun stuff. But Over the last few years, it's actually really morphed into how do I still run a business and still be a good dad and a good husband, a good friend, to guys in my community or my peers. What else about me? I like the outdoors. You can see behind me, actually, this is a map of Indiana and the pictures around it. My two boys and I, we have a goal to go camping at all the Indiana state parks. So love spending time outdoors, love, imparting or training my two boys on how to survive in the wilderness and all that stuff. And we'll sit around the campfire and, discuss life with a 6-year-old, things like
That's
that. So that's
awesome.
fun.
No, I love
Yeah.
that. How many of you guys got to so far? Do you have a number in mind that you've done? I know your kids are super young, so just curious.
We've been to 3.
Okay.
So every time we hit a park, we take a good picture and I post it on the board. It's a thing we do.
Cool.
And I think there's like 28 or something.
Yeah. I
So
love
we
that.
got some work to do.
Yeah. No, I love that because you're just in a season of life. I know we've had a lot of conversations about how do you run a business, but also be a good dad, to be a good husband and pursue that and to do these fun things with your family, like travel. And you talked about one of your dreams was spending a month with your family overseas and your wife. I don't know if I'm supposed to say that, but you guys are talking about that and dreaming and visioning, not just scaling your business and making a certain amount of money, but you're dreaming of these experiences. Has that been something that's like a recent thing, or have you always just kind of been like that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say in the last few years, it's something that's become much more important to me. It's come front and center on my radar there. We're here to talk about generational stuff and not just real estate investing, but that was a big part of how I grew up. My mom wasn't working anymore. She was a teacher before, all of us kids were around. But she was a stay-at-home mom. Dad had a job until I think I was 6 or 7. And after that, he was around a lot. And so we got to spend a lot of time together as a family and do a lot of things. And that was just my way of life. Right. Like I didn't know any different. Right. I'm a kid. And I thought everybody got home from school and their mom was there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so now, with a 6 and 8-year-old, some of this stuff, you look back on it, and you're like, oh, like that was different. That was actually a pretty big deal for my parents to be able to do stuff like that. And it's fun to be able to offer that to my kids too. And it's funny to think about, like, they have no reference otherwise now
Right.
either.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's become much more important, I'd say, recently. And truthfully, something that really kind of tipped the scales for me was I think it was a podcast that I was listening to, and the guy was talking about, he was, say, 40 years old or so, and he was talking about how he had built this big business and they, scaled it up and sold it for millions and had all of this success, right? Like air quotes around this success. And, the interviewer said, if you had to do it all over, what would you change? And he said, my kids are all grown up now. I have the rest of my life to go build a business if I want to do it, because they're off to college. They're building their own families and everything now. He's like, I did it backwards. When your kids are young and they're in the house, spend time with them, because that's what's important, and then go build whatever business you want. And that kind of made like a light bulb go off. And so luckily that was at the end of last year. So we kind of I adjusted some of my planning efforts, and I'm like, all right, we're gonna tweak things a little bit and dial back. So
yeah. No, that's great advice, because I just turned 43 and I have a 16-year-old now, and so a lot of times it depends on when you've had kids, but yeah, a lot of times our 20s and 30s are typically if we've had kids, are typically in that the young stages, and by the time we reach 40, mid 40s to 50, then yeah, our kids are teenagers or are growing up a little bit more. So it's kind of a backwards thing. But with the 20s and 30s and typically 40s is when that's like our prime of working, right? 20, 25, 30
Yep.
years of building and scaling. But it's also the time we're raising kids. So that's awesome. So I love that. So we're really just wanting to dive into kind of this third generation real estate investing or third generation entrepreneurship, right? It didn't have to be real estate or whatever, but I want to dive into that. I mean, I know I've known you for a while. You are a real estate investor, own a construction company. You dabble in, you got a multifamily, multiple units, and then your dad has lived in Columbus, Indiana, he's been at the real estate investment groups and has spoke, and he's had a lot of rental properties, a lot of experience in real estate investing, but it actually started with your grandpa, right? So can you kind of just take us back, maybe just tell us a story a little bit about the Graysons and maybe start with how did all this get started, right? And then bring us up to you, because you're sitting here from the things that you learned from decades ago.
Yeah. All right. How many hours do we have now?
We got about 14. So
there's no shortage of stories here. But yeah, so grandpa, my grandpa, my dad's dad, gainfully employed, right? Had a great job there in town for Cummins Engines. And for whatever reason, he started buying some rental property. Probably as a backup plan or whatever. But it's interesting because back in those days, he had to be kind of secretive about it, right? We live in the day and age of side hustles, right? And you could go to your 9-to-5 job and talk about your side hustle and how well it's going and stuff. But back then it was kind of frowned upon. And eventually, the time came for Cummins to do some layoffs. And so the story, as I've been told, is that they went in to lay my grandpa off because they knew he had other income.
Gotcha.
And I mean, luckily he did, right? But that was kind of interesting because I remember when I was buying my first property, I actually lived in Dallas at the time. And I remember my dad coaching me like, hey, don't talk about this at work. Because of what happened to grandpa.
Yeah, that passed on from generations.
Yeah, so that was kind of funny.
Interesting.
But yeah, I mean, man, I have memories of like Grandpa Grayson coming in from a long day of working on his rentals, and he would wear like an apron or those little like cloth aprons you can get free from the supply stores. Stuff like that. He drove a big old station wagon and he loved to fish. That was his thing. So
I've always wanted, my wife makes fun of me, but I've always wanted a station wagon. And a lot of times, I don't know why, but I've always just pictured me driving a station wagon. I've never owned one, but most entrepreneurs, they're envisioning a Ferrari or a Bentley or something like that. And I envision a wood paneled station wagon. So.
Oh my God, you're gonna love this. All right. So Grandpa had a big full-size blue, like baby blue station wagon. He actually, I don't know if you can see it. This is my wall of like weird stuff that I find in houses we flip. But I got this bumper sticker. It says a bad day fishing is better than a good day at work. And he always had that bumper sticker on the back.
That's awesome.
And so I keep that up on the shelf.
Wow, that's cool.
But that was Grandpa. Just really quickly on the station wagon thing, I grew up in a full-size wood panel station wagon. That was awesome. My first vehicle.
You were literally the Griswolds, like
very much. So it gets better. Oh, it gets better. I'm the youngest of three. I have an older brother, older sister. We all had wood paneled station wagons.
Really?
At one point, there were 3 wood paneled station wagons in the Grayson driveway.
Like you had one?
Different color.
Like you drove it? Like you drove one?
I drove one.
Wow.
We all did.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Like, and this was growing up, like when you still lived at home?
Yep.
Wow. So
that was
the car. Did you pick that, or like your dad, your parents were like, Here you go. You know?
No, so my dad was a school supply salesman.
Mm-hmm.
And he covered a lot of territory, but he was all over Indiana all week long. And he loved the station wagon. You could fit a bunch of stuff in the back. As real estate investors, we know how important it is to be able to carry a full sheet of plywood inside the vehicle. It was that big.
That's awesome. Yeah,
So he
plywood,
loved them.
drywall, probably.
Oh yeah, everything.
That's awesome. I love that.
So yeah, he loved him for his work, and then
Yeah.
as he would retire his own, he would hand it down to whoever just turned 16. So
That is cool. That is cool, man. I wish I
yeah,
had that picture. Yeah, if you ever see a good wood panel station wagon, every time I pass one, and it's like what, $3,200, I'm like, oh, that looks like really cool. Um, anyway, so your grandpa kind of started. He had this secret, these rental properties that he couldn't really tell. Then he gets laid off, and then did he get another job? Did he go kind of, build some more income with rentals, or what did that look like for his life, kind of moving forward?
I think at that point the landlording became a full-time
Yeah,
occupation for him.
gotcha.
So I mean, business as usual in the Grayson house. I think my parents actually, the first house they lived in as a married couple was a rental that my grandpa owned. It might still actually be in the family.
Mm.
So the whole time I mentioned my dad was a school supply salesman. So while he was doing that, they were kind of building up their rental portfolio. Until a time came and he also got let go.
Wow.
So I remember sitting at the dining table, and of course I'm young enough that it didn't mean anything to me at the time, but it was a very serious conversation. They sat us down like, Dad's not going to be doing school supply sales anymore. We're gonna just be landlords. And I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
Can
Can I go play my Nintendo now?
Right. But it's just so funny to think about some of those little inconsequential times or conversations, and how actually they were like a massive turning point, right?
Yeah.
For my parents.
Wow.
So yeah, I mean, from then that's really when the time started where it was like I didn't know any different, right?
How old were you when that was going on?
I think I was either 6 or 7.
Okay, so you were like really young, yeah. So you don't have much, memory before that. So
yeah, I mean, it didn't register.
So your dad basically he became. So that's kind of like it's been his full time, pretty much his career ever since you've kind of known, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Interesting. So what did that look like for you growing up too? And I'm sorry to cut you off, but yeah, just answer that. And then, what did that look like for you, I guess, learning and seeing through that with your own dad?
Yeah. I mean, so the theme of all of this, right, is that, even when I was so young, I had no idea what was actually happening, right? I didn't know what was a big deal or not. But the whole time it was still, in the back of my mind. You're as a kid, you're a sponge, right? Mm-hmm. I constantly learn this with my 6 and 8-year-old is like, I'll say something that has no weight in my mind, and then 8 months from then they'll say it back to me. I'm like, where'd you learn that?
You promised that we could have ice cream after
right.
before bed. 8 months ago.
But I mean, so they like I mentioned, mom and dad were always home, and that was just a way of life. We were myself and my brother, we were very involved in scouts, Boy Scouts. Mm-hmm. So dad was like the troop leader. We had monthly campouts that he was always on. He would always go on, the big annual backpacking trip to Yosemite or whatever. And I mean, to me, that was normal. As an adult, I look back and I'm like, that's actually very incredible.
Yeah. Yeah.
That he could do all that. Mm-hmm. We had youth group at our house every week, just all that stuff. And so I didn't know it at the time, right, when I was young, but all of this stuff was kind of creating the foundation. And so now, as a father and older, I I can see how I've taken those things and kind of also built on top of them,
Mm.
where my 8-year-old sometimes would be like, "Dad, you're never around."
Mm.
And I'm like, "Dude, I get you on the school bus like half the days of the week. I'm home. I'm here when you get off the school bus some days.
Yeah.
I volunteer in your school. I'm always around, right?"
Yeah.
But if there's like a couple days where I have to work late or do something in the evening, he's like, "Gosh, you're never around anymore."
Yeah.
And I just sit here and I'm like, wait till you're an adult and you realize
This is
how
not
much I
normal.
was, around
Yeah.
and annoying you. Um,
And it's just you've painted that foundation too, that's all they know. They're like, Dad usually is around. That's the
yeah,
picture you painted, right? So then now,
that
since you're not there for a couple nights, their expectation is for you to be there.
that's right. Yeah. I mean, so let's see. Oh, I'll probably butcher the dates and stuff, but I left my full-time job just before my youngest was born.
Mm.
So he actually has no idea,
Yeah.
that I used to go work 12 hours a day
Yeah.
for a construction company. So, yeah, it's that part is kind of cool. But you can kind of draw a parallel between, that's home life type
Mm-hmm.
stuff. Um, it also kind of equates to, or it's similar to the business side of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
I also watch them build their business. And, there's so many, as I'm talking to my wife, kind of preparing for our conversation here today, I'm like, man, what story should I tell? And, there's all these crazy things, but like, I remember sitting, we had family dinner, and I remember sitting at the dinner table, and Dad would get up because the doorbell rang and it was one of their tenants, and he was just dropping off rent
Mm.
at our house. Like, could you
Gave,
imagine that? Like
gave the
now?
tenant your address. Like, hey,
Right.
you know what? Just come over at 6 p.m.
Yeah,
and
just
just drop
and he would come back with like a wad of $100 bills. Like, what?
he just stuffed it. Yeah.
Yeah. So like
Oh man.
that was a normal thing to me growing
Yeah.
up.
Mm.
I mean, not like super normal, but
So do
not
you give
out of the
any?
question.
So do you give any of your tenants your home address and just say, hey, if you can't, just drop it off on Saturday.
Oh, absolutely not.
That is hilarious.
I mean, and to go one step farther back, I remember just hearing stories about how grandpa, they would have the tenants over for dinner,
Wow.
and it's not like it's a bad thing, right?
Yeah.
This is nothing against like landlords and tenants and
Hmm.
stuff. But it's just so funny to think about how, different it was way back then.
Yeah.
Um,
Wow.
Now we're like, don't
Don't
call me
don't
unless the
don't come.
building's on fire.
Yeah.
We're going to direct deposit, take the money out of
Yeah.
your account
Make
every
it as easy
month.
as
Like,
possible. Don't waste my time
yeah,
on yeah.
yeah. But, back then it was a relationship thing.
Yeah, for sure.
And
For sure.
that's kind of cool. So,
Yeah.
um, but, to the point, just the same way the growing up was kind of building the foundation without even kind of recognizing it. The same thing happens in business,
Mm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Where if you boil down everything we do to manage our investments and everything my parents did to manage or do to manage their investments, it's all the same stuff, but it just looks very different.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. I get the takeaway would be find out what works for you and do it, get really good at it.
Mm-hmm.
One thing's not better than the other, but it's funny to me when I go home for, holidays or whatever, and they have an office at home and there's a stack of papers, a foot deep And I'm like, what is all that? And they're like, oh, those are receipts and all this stuff. And I'm like, don't you use Dropbox?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah. Can't you
um,
scan those in?
right.
Keep.
So, we're all doing the same thing.
Yeah,
We're out there managing property and all the same stuff, but it just looks very different. And
yeah.
it just always, it reminds me of the quote that, I'll probably butcher, but it's, we're all out here standing on the shoulders of giants.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Right. And we're all just soaking in, learning, taking things and building on top of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's what my parents did with my grandpa, and then that's what I'm doing now. And I mean, certainly I would love to see it continue. But who really knows what the future holds? So
Yeah. So one question I had was, a lot of times, so as parents, we want to instill into our children just the wisdom from our experiences, from our failures, what we've learned along the way. And, I don't know about you, but as a dad, I'm always like, how do I pour into my kids or instill that wisdom into the kids? And I'm always trying to think about just creative types of ways. Was there any time that your dad or your grandpa would sit you down and talk to you about real estate or business, or was it really just the modeling approach where like you just saw what they did and not only business, but it sounds like your dad also modeled how to be a great dad, which you mentioned at the beginning of the show, right? He showed up and he was part of your organizations with the scouts and youth groups and all that. So I guess my question would be, did you guys sit down and they kind of like teach and have some different wisdom lessons or whatever about real estate or business or whatever? Or was it just, you just watched them do it?
it was much more just being the model.
Yeah.
Right. And as a dad now, I know how impactful that can be. Like we go about our day and it's mundane to us, right? We make decisions, we do certain things that mean really nothing, but the whole time your kids are watching. I'm in a group at church that's just, we're all fathers of young children.
Mm-hmm.
And I call it a support group because half the time we just sit there and talk about, what we're struggling with. But a recurring theme in that is if you're trying to impart something specific onto your kids, like you better be showing them how it's done. And so it appears in different ways, right? As you're raising your kids, it can be, just the other night, earlier this week, we were playing a card game downstairs. It was just me and the two boys, and my youngest starts crying because he's losing. And, so we had to jump on that moment, right? And talk about that. And, it's a game and it's okay to be emotional, but don't let it, all this stuff. So the same thing, with business though, is I'm seeing how he treats his tenants. I'm seeing how he talks about the contractors that they hire, all that stuff. And this is funny. I didn't prepare this ahead of time, but last week I was walking the job site with kind of my number two. And we were walking around the job site, and I talked to the tile guy, and I forget exactly what I even said, but I said something, and I turned around and I was like, oh my gosh. Like I just had a flashback to walking job sites with my dad. And every time, we'd be walking out the door and he goes, all right, looking good. Or whatever. And I did the exact same thing, and it's like 30 years later, and I said it with the same inflection and the exact same way that he would do it. And I'm like, oh my gosh, we've really come full circle on this.
Yeah. That's cool.
So I mean, much more of the modeling thing. Of course, now, like, he's my dad is my mentor. He's my secret weapon, right? Where if I'm struggling with anything, I can text him and call him, and he's got the answer. He's been doing it for 50 years or whatever now.
Yeah.
So now it's much more just nuts and bolts and like, hey, I got this tenant that wants to do XYZ. How should I handle it?
Yeah.
So
yeah, is he gonna say have him over for dinner?
yeah.
That'd be funny. Yeah, just talk to him about over dinner. Just invite him out.
Oh my gosh, I couldn't imagine.
Oh, that's awesome. So I love what you're saying, that a lot of times, again, we try to teach our kids something, but I think just modeling it is the best. I think, especially as a Christian dad, we're like, how do I pass that on, or how do I teach them or do devotionals with them? But 90% of it is really just you yourself being in the Word and modeling it. So totally agree with that. Your dad was also very involved with you in your scouts and your different organizations. And you've obviously talked about you're in a season of life. You want to spend time with your kids and take them with different experiences. And your dad would take you to, the parks and camping and all that stuff. So talk about kind of that season of your life. Let's just transition into you as a dad, as a husband. You have this business, and you say you spend a lot of your time focusing on how do I run the business, but also be a good dad, a good husband. And the way to do that, I think, is to do these things, right? To do these undistracted types of experiences that they'll remember. So take us into that.
Yeah. I mean, again, right? So we'll start here where your kids are going to take clues from you. Mm-hmm. And if you make family things a priority, then whether or not they realize it, they're going to do similar, right? So, I mean, that's the starting point. As entrepreneurs, investors, whatever title we're going to take, we get pulled in a lot of different directions, mm-hmm. right? And it can be stressful. There's times for that. There's times to celebrate and everything in between. So what I like to do, this may not be the recipe for everybody, but there's two things I like to do, and I've found success in it. Like, it works for me and my family. And the first is to be like what I would refer to as awkwardly authentic. We're as dads, we're still learning this stuff, mm-hmm. right? Like, the best kept secret about parenting is that nobody actually really knows what they're doing. Mm-hmm. And
don't tell anybody. That's a secret.
Right? The secret's out. So, there's been times where I've lost my temper or something, right? And I think there's a lot of value in being awkwardly authentic with your kids afterwards and saying, like, look, I shouldn't have been that way. Here's why I was that way. I'm sorry it came out like that, whatever. But also, on the business side of things, talking about some of that stuff with them, right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't always get delivered or received rather the way I'm hoping, but like, there's some certain people we'll talk about, and my 6-year-old will go, oh, is that the guy trying to steal money from our business? Well, I mean,
he's like,
yeah,
standing
kind of, but like,
that's funny.
But it's the same thing. Like, why do I really need to try to hide that stuff? Yeah. Like, if I'm really carrying some sort of burden or stress or whatever, I would almost rather just bring it up and say, like, hey, like, I'm not having a good day. Mm-hmm. And here's why, and I'm working on it. Right.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things I try to do. Another, thing that happens with us is we get pulled in 1,000 different directions, right? It's Saturday. You've got sporting events to get the kids to. You've got a birthday party this afternoon. You need to run this material over here for the job and whatever. I actually really enjoy kind of mashing up work and life a
Mm-hmm.
little bit. And I
Mm-hmm.
know that's like a very deep topic for a lot of people, is the whole work-life balance and separation and all that.
Mm-hmm.
I like to mash it up, because that's kind of how I live my life,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think it can be a cool thing to do with your kids. So if they have Martin Luther King off of school, right? So they'll hop in the truck and go visit job sites with me, and they may go to the office and sit through a meeting with me or something, and kind of see it. Now it only lasts so long, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
they'll
Can't
get
be
sick
all
of it.
day. 6-year-old.
But I mean, it's cool. Like I've taken my 8-year-old around, and we'll hammer we buy houses signs
Mm-hmm.
in the yards and things like that. So he's got a little sweatshirt that has the company logo on it, and we'll go out and we'll do stuff
Oh,
like that. And
that's awesome.
so it's checking a box for a thing I needed to get done for work, and I get to spend time with my family at the same time.
Yeah. And it's a great,
That's
yeah.
cool.
It's a great modeling thing too, and I think that's actually honestly good. The more I just start to think about it, and I don't do it the best with kind of mashing things up, but I do think that can be some extreme health to that because honestly, I think a lot of kids don't know what their dad does. I don't know if they even know. Like if you ask them, like, "What's your dad do?" Like they really don't even know at all. They don't know anything about it. And I just think, to model that and to show them I think it's great to get into the kids' world. Obviously, your dad did that with the scouts and kind of getting into that world. I coach my son in basketball, and I like going and visiting at the school because I think there's something different. Like when you walk into their classroom and that's their world, and they just light up because now you're in their world and they want to
Yeah.
show you everything what their world is like. And I think we can do the same thing with our work and they light up too because now they get to walk into your world. And I think if we can do more of that as dads and families, I think it's awesome. So
Yeah.
that's good
Yeah.
advice, man. I know we're about out of time for this show, but really any just last, things, any last story that you want to share or just moving on now, right? You talked about your grandpa and your dad having that foundation with you, and now you're owning your own business. And now, will it be a fourth generation? Maybe not real estate investor. Will it be another business owner possibly? But yeah, maybe just take us any last stories or any last words of wisdom as we cut off the show.
Yeah. I'll say so. My dad didn't know that I was going to do this, right? As I was growing up. Um, After college, my wife and I moved around the country for about 10 years, and eventually landed back here in Indianapolis. When we got back to Indianapolis, um, my dad is a speaker, right? So he would travel a little bit, talking, coaching and stuff about landlording. Now they're way down in Columbus, Indiana. It's like an hour and a half south of Indy,
Mm-hmm.
right? Way down there. And it was never on my radar that I would be walking around looking at property in Indianapolis, and people would go, "Hey, do you know Brad Grayson?" And I'm like, "What?" Like he's way down in
Yeah,
Columbus,
yeah,
Indiana.
right.
Um, I mean, he was a little involved, but there have been just the most comical or ironic like connections to
Hmm.
oh yeah, I know Brad. Are you guys related or whatever? I'm like, he's my dad. Um, but it's like well, perfect example, right? You and I know one of the members of Iron Deep, and on the retreat, the first night, I've never met this guy in my life, and it was a get to know, people at your table, and he and I sit down, and he goes, "All right, what's your name?" I say, "Pat Grayson," and he goes, "Grayson." that sounds familiar. Do you know Brad Grayson? And I'm like, you got to be kidding me.
Right.
Right? Like
Yeah.
two random people we had never met before. We both flew halfway across the country to Utah and we're sitting in a room together. And this guy knows my dad. And like
funny.
knows him like fairly well at that. And so I'll put a bow on it like this. Like you never know what's really going to play out long term.
Mm-hmm.
So I like to say, right, live above the line.
Mm-hmm.
Do good, be good. All that golden rule stuff, treat people how you want to be treated, because now I'm doing business in Indianapolis. And now keep in mind, like my business is totally separate than my parents' business. We don't work together. We don't, do anything together on the business side. But people in Indy have a relationship, or at least know my father. And I'm like, I am so grateful that he's a good person.
Yeah.
That he's not like a swindler and a slumlord and like all this stuff. And I never thought that would be something I would be grateful for, but the way he operates his business, even though it's an hour and a half south of where I run mine, it has an impact on the success of my business just because of the way he handles himself.
I love that.
And I find that just so fascinating.
Yeah. No, I love that. It's because it seems like everyone who actually asked, do you know Brad Grayson? It was a positive ask. Oh, yeah. do you know, it was never like, oh, huh. You related to, that swindler. Yeah. So that's
you
awesome.
Owe me 10 grand.
Yeah. Generation. Yeah. That's awesome. Well, thanks, Patrick, for being on the podcast today. I appreciate you. This was an awesome show, awesome stories. I know you have a lot of other stories, and maybe, I know we talked about possibly putting together a video in the future, just kind of on your family. But this has been amazing. Appreciate you being on the podcast and wish you so much success, buddy.
Hey, thanks. Happy to be here.
All right. See you guys next time.